The other locomotive that we're operating on the standard gauge colliery railway for this event is number 18, which was the Seaham Harbour Railway's number 18. It was also the Londonderry Railway's number 18. It was built in 1877 by Stephen Lewin of Poole, hence we know it as the Lewin. Although in reality, I think you have to consider this engine a product of the Seaham Harbour Engine Works, because very little of the original survived, several rebuilds in Seaham. So originally built as a well tank, and what that means is the water tanks, unlike a saddle tank which is sitting over the top of the boiler, or a side tank which would sit to one side, were actually carried between the frames, and the components of the tank made up part of the frame structure. The locomotive operated initially like that at Seaham, very kind of skeletal almost in appearance, but quite quickly they obviously found that was unsuitable, and they added tanks each side of the boiler to the front as wing tanks, and then a plate between them and the bunkers here, which did give the impression that it had side tanks. And it had a cab at that point as well, fully enclosed. It ran like that for a number of years, but by 1936 its appearance had changed, and I've struggled to find a record of when or why that took place, but it's fair to say that the photos showing from 1936 onwards show this engine rather than all the predecessor components that kind of make it up. It was also outshopped in this rather nice North Eastern Railway livery, so we kind of have a point in time. We can say before that time it was this, we're fairly uncertain of, and after this date it was this locomotive. It was also said for many years to have been built in 1863, which at one point made it the oldest working locomotive in the world, but that's much challenged, and I think we're pretty safe on the date 1877, in part due to the fact that Lewis didn't start building engines until about 1873, 1874, which would have made it difficult for them to achieve that before that day. So 1877, so it's 143 years old now, so it should hopefully see 150 years like Coffee Pot in service at Beamish. Supplied to the Londonderry Railway for working at Seaham Harbour, a number of functions, primarily working on the staiths, collecting spilt coal, onto the beach for collecting stones which were used in the concrete making process they had there, which was for reinforcing the breakwaters. And then in 1899 the Londonderry Railway became the Seaham Harbour Dock Company by Act of Parliament, and the locomotive transferred along with all the other assets on the harbour side at that point. So it worked all the way through to 1969, so a very well sweated asset. It's like 93 years or so in service, although not continuously, with some periods out of use. It had an open cab from 1936 to about 1960, and then it was rebuilt with an enclosed cab. And for those who know Seaham, you would think an open cab was never going to be a desirable feature in that location, given the weather and the kind of fact that a lot of the lines went out essentially into the sea on the breakwaters. However, that's presumably how it was preferred. It came to Beamish in 1975. So it had a number of years dismantled out of use at Seaham, and I think they had aspirations there to restore it to steam themselves, but by 75 it was at Beamish. And then towards the mid to late 70s it was rebuilt by a company in Hartlepool using apprentice labour, and they were given the brief to turn it back to how it looked when it was built in 1877, and basically that consisted of a photograph, well, two photographs, and a collection of parts. So they did their best, I think it would be fair to say, with the resources at the time and the information they had. And the locomotive was commissioned into service at Beamish in the late 70s. It ran sporadically for a few years, but I believe was not particularly sort of reliable at that time. There was also a shortage of such things as lubricators, such as these, which it had to share with Coffee Pot for many years, till these were recovered from a grain siphon on a quayside, I think. So the locomotive went out of service, was stored and then dismantled. Eventually it went to a scheme in Lancashire where they had hopes of overhauling it on behalf of the museum and then using it for a number of years. That scheme fell through and the locomotive was rescued back to Beamish, and then a number of other people sort of showed interest thereafter in trying to restore it. When we looked at doing Coffee Pot, it was this engine which was really kind of number one on the list, but I felt it would be useful for me to cut my teeth on something that was more manageable before getting to this. But its turn came, and basically everything from the running plate upwards, with the exception of the firebox, is new. Everything below that is original to Seaham, and the frame plates and driving wheels are probably original to the original Stephen Lewin locomotive. No well tanks now, water's carried in the side tank. All the superstructure is new, it's a replica, Things like these black hawthorn style sandboxes were made to patterns by Dave Young again, their replica. And then the front section of the engine, which had distorted quite badly, all of the frames in about that area were chopped out and replaced, and we've actually gone for thicker metal in that area to try and eliminate that problem. One of the issues being that the valve chests are behind the cylinders here, which means the cylinders and all the action of the locomotive when it's moving is quite a long way out from the centre line, and with quite thin frames, because it was originally built as a cheap contractor's locomotive, it was quite prone to distorting. Probably had a number of very rough shunts as well during its life at Seaham. Certainly number 17, which was one of the other coffee pot locomotives, was shortened by about 6 inches, so one can only assume the worst if that's your idea of a repair, you know, that you have to chop parts of the engine away. So basically what we're looking at is a fairly conventional 040 saddle tank. It's quite petite, it looks very, very small when it's next to rolling stock of more conventional sizes. The buffers are adapted for operating with children wagons, so running here it's working with the wagons that it did do from the day it arrived in Seaham. The larger top buffer beam enables it to operate with more conventional rolling stock. But by and large it is what it is. It's a very charming, very pretty, quite cute little steam engine, which we very much enjoy having at the museum.
Okay, so after Paul's explanation of the history of this loco, I'll take you through my bit, which is essentially the operation and maintenance of the number 18. Number 18 is quite a bit important part of my Beamish story, because when I first started at Beamish, the engine had been overhauled but was not a reliable everyday engine. In fact, it was a little bit of a frustration initially. So my brief when I first started was to make this engine into something that we could use regularly, maybe 30 days a year. We've actually surpassed that, because at one point before the coronavirus pandemic struck, we were doing about 15 days a month with it through the summer season, so we've achieved. So the locomotive is quite a difficult thing to maintain. You are taking 1877 technology and trying to make it work daily with, you know, a certain amount of maintenance, but maintenance that we can fund and staff easily in the 2020 world, and that can be quite a challenge. With this engine though, we have managed to balance modern stuff that you can't see at all. We try not to use modern equipment on the locomotive at all, but there are a couple of instances where this has got changes from its original design. So the first thing we did with number 18, the inside of the smoke box, which is this area at the front of the engine, all the exhaust gases from the fire go up the chimney, and the exhaust from the engine goes up the chimney. And the effect of the exhaust going up the chimney draws the fire. And the science behind how that does that is quite a complicated thing. And one of the main issues with the engine in 2014 was that the exhaust from the cylinders was going up the chimney, but it was just spraying it up the chimney and it wasn't drawing the fire at all. So we modified the inside of the smoke box. For those of you with a technical steam interest, it's now got a multi-jet blast nozzle on it. For those of you who aren't interested in technical steam, it now works very well. So it now draws the fire very effectively, works really well. Towards the back of the engine, the arisings from the fire. So fire burns on a cast iron grate within the firebox, and as the fire's burning, the ash drops through the grate into the ash pan below it. And through your day's service, or at the end of the day, you have to empty all the ash out as you would with a household fire. Because of the length of the footplate at the back of the engine, it's an awkward thing to do. And the old ash pan was life expired, so we decided that we would change the ash pan, but to make it easier to ash out, you can't see this modification from the outside, which is exactly what we want to achieve. The bottom of the ash pan slopes, so all you have to do now is damp the ash down, floods out of the bottom of the ash pan you stay very clean, you don't get dusty, underneath the engine stays clean as well. It's a great advantage. So they're the two main modifications we've done to make this a user-friendly thing. We've done other things with the equipment for the injectors, which put the water from the tank into the boiler to make those work effectively. They worked, but intermittently when we first started with it. They're now very successful. The regulator, which is essentially like the throttle pedal in your car, is located inside the black dome at the top, and that lets the steam out of the boiler to the cylinders, and the further open that is, the more power you get, the same as the throttle in your car. Again, that was a minor problem in 2014, and we've now cured that, and when we overhaul this engine again, it's going to get its original regulator back in, properly overhauled. At the moment it's got a temporary one in that works.